So I'm going to talk to you about a book project I'm finishing this week, I think, on a survey of Jewish American war literature. And basically what I've been doing is looking at the literature with the question of what it tells us about post-war Jewish American life. So I use literature, and this tends to follow my training and my belief theoretically that literature often gives us good historical models if we work carefully with it. So that's how I'll be talking about it. So first I'm going to give an overview generally of Jewish American war service in World War II, followed by a discussion of some of the works and what I think they tell us about post-war America. So more than 500,000 Jewish American men, and this was nearly half of the Jewish American male population between the ages of 18 and 40 served in World War II. Jews were primarily in the army, which was the case with my own family, with a very small amount entering the Navy and the Marine Corps, and a disproportionately high number, as you may guess, in the medical and dental corps as well. Just over 35,000 died in comparison with more than 400,000 general American casualties. And war service had an incredibly profound impact on Jewish American life, an impact that was so strong I think that we don't actually recognize the depth of it. So as with African American men who went to war and came back expecting that they would now not have to face continued discrimination because they had fought heroically in the war, so too many Jews came back from the war expecting at this point discrimination it was time for it to end. And we see that this did happen not only with the news of the Holocaust, but right after the war, there was a drastic reduction in public acts of anti-Semitism in the United States. Also, many Jews felt that because they had served, they now had the right to be treated the same as white Americans. And moreover, that they no longer had to sort of melt into the Anglo model of the melting pot norm, and that they could actually publicly proclaim their Jewishness. And the GI Bill of 1944 as well helped impel an entire generation of Jews into the middle classes as they were able to get better educated, and by so doing, enter the middle class, which would assist the trend that we know happened after the war in the United States of Jews becoming much wealthier and better educated and more middle class rather than it being a working class population as before the war. So by entering the military, Jews had not only to face the anti-Semitism that was endemic in the military, which I'm going to talk about, but they also had to overcome this legacy of Jewish American men who were considered to be weaklings, who were too effeminate, too intellectual, too cowardly to be effective warriors. And that's what my book talks about, this transition into this sort of warrior status. And there's this misconception that the Sabra, the invention of the masculine male Jew, was really invented in Israel. There was the same narrative happening in the United States as well. So enlisting in war service enabled Jews for the first time to take on a generic American identity, where they were the same as a whole class of Americans who were being defined foremost by their national status. Moreover, since World War II enlistees were younger than those who joined in World War I, it meant that for many war service occurred when these people were coming of age and turning from boys into men. And this new understanding of what it meant to be a Jewish American was transmitted in a wave of best-selling novels by and about Jewish soldiers that I think mark a real watershed in Jewish life. So what I'm going to do is talk about that. I should have mentioned, I'll talk for about half an hour and then I'll do questions. So on December 5th, 1948, the New York Times cultural correspondent, Charles Poor, offered an overview of the year's major literary trends, and he noted that 1948 will go down in American literary history as the year that America rediscovered the war. But what he was describing was a new genre of World War II fiction that was written almost entirely by Jews and had all of the central protagonists as Jewish soldiers. And that year, in 1948, I was stunned when I did this research, because my aim as well was to move beyond sort of the canonical ideas of what Jewish American literature is as Bellow, Roth, etc., and see what were people reading. So what I did was I went through all the bestseller lists and started to look at what were American Jews reading. And what I discovered, to my shock, was that in 1948, there were 5 novels, 5, buying about Jewish soldiers that dominated the New York Times bestseller list, 5 of them. And there's actually a 6th one, Martha Gellhorn's The Wine of Astonishment, that also sold well that year. So if you look at the bestsellers list, 6 of the novels that are actually absolutely dominating are buying about Jewish soldiers. And the novels are The Naked and the Dead, The Young Lions, An Act of Love by Ira Wolfert, Merle Miller's That Winter, and Stephen Heim's The Crusaders. So critical studies often groups together American war fiction and looks at it as a genre to seek out what's common to it. But I think that focusing on these general trends within war novels overlooks historically specific aspects of the literature, which is what I'm interested in, including how the authors were impacted by their varying backgrounds. So by looking at Jewish war novels as a distinct group, very clear patterns start emerging. These authors were writing as young Jewish men and women, and their war was impacted upon profoundly by their Jewishness. And to overlook or negate this, I think misses major subthemes in these works that were quite crucial in post-war America. But nevertheless, many of these works are overlooked because they're not considered high art, and they're considered minor stature. But I think that by revisiting bestseller lists as literary historians, what we're able to do is see what was popular culture really about, and ask ourselves if Jewish American studies can start to consider these larger trends that were taking place in popular discourse besides the sort of higher works that were being published. So while I'm going to focus on 1948 as the watershed year when Jewish war novels dominated the bestseller list, in fact, throughout the 1950s and 1960s, which my book covers, the entire field of World War II writing was overwhelmingly led by Jewish writers. In the 50s, the top-selling novels were Herman Wouk's The Caine Mutiny, about a battleship in the Pacific, and that was the highest-selling American novel after Gone with the Wind, and the winner of the 1952 Pulitzer Prize. And Leah Garrett also published war novels in the 50s that were huge bestsellers. And in the early 60s, it was Joseph Heller's massive, massive bestseller, Catch-22, that brought this idea into war writing that you could take a satirical style and look at it through the lens of comedy, which would influence on how Kurt Vonnegut and Thomas Pynchon would write about the war. The only non-Jewish writer, because I've gone through all of the bestseller lists, of World War II novels that had anywhere of either a popular or critical impact was James Jones, who wrote From Here to Eternity and The Thin Red Line. But as I'm not going to talk about today, but how my work talks about, he was hugely influenced by his relationship with Norman Mailer and Irwin Shaw and their writings as well. So Hessia Diner recently exploded the myth that Jewish Americans were largely silent about the Holocaust until after the trial of Adolf Eichmann in the Six-Day War. And my work complements this by showing that 4 of the best-selling novels of 1948 included extremely explicit portraits of the death camps and the extermination of the Jews. And this is far earlier than sort of public myth has thought we were writing about the Holocaust in the United States. So although the novels I'm going to talk about were primarily about World War II and the experiences of American soldiers, all of the European-based stories describe in often graphic and very extensive detail the machinery of the death camps and the trauma of the Jews in Europe. So cloaking reportage of the exterminations within these war novels that were meant for popular consumption was a way, I think, that these very early writers were getting the story of the Holocaust across to American readers. So then my work extends on Diner's concepts as well. She only talks really about works written by Jews for Jews, and I'm talking about works written by Jews that were primarily for non-Jewish readership. And what this meant is that these Jewish American war novels were, with their machinery of the death camp descriptions, were reaching a very broad mass audience in the United States right after the war. But these novels offer a very distinctly American perspective on the Holocaust, because what they focus on is that epical moment when General Patton's army, his forward-moving army, liberated Dachau during the German retreat. So even though, in fact, very few American GIs were actually at the liberation of the camps, though many American Jews claim they were there was actually very few who were there. In all of the war novels, the Jewish soldier is there at the liberation of Dachau. So they portray the moment of that liberation of Dachau as that moment when the Shoah was brought home to Americans generally and Jewish Americans specifically. And in fact, I would assert that these novels had such an impact on post-war America that it's almost, and I sort of build this argument in my book, that it's almost the way that we often look at sort of many Jews in Hollywood invented these cultural aspects such as Christmas, Isaiah Berlin, etc. Jewish Americans really were inventing for post-war America the means of understanding the recent war. And what they were doing was teaching their readers to look at it along with the Holocaust. So these 6 novels that I'm going to talk about created a trend where the soldier was very different from how he had been constructed in previous World War literature, particularly World War I literature and Hemingway and John Dos Passos' works. In the Jewish war novels, unlike in Hemingway, where, as Hemingway said, the soldier does not fear, the Jewish soldier, in fact, confronts profound fears and internal ruminations about what this means and how scared he feels. But his fears are very unique in these novels because what he confronts in these novels are a myriad of different enemies. He's facing Americans within his own platoon who hate him because he's a Jew. He's facing Germans who want to kill him for being a Jew and for being an American. And he's facing Japanese who want to attack him because he's American. So his survival depends on suppressing these worries and acting bravely. But rather than avoiding these descriptions of fear, these novels really discuss those dark emotions and angst felt by those in combat. But in the starkest difference between World War II novels, which as I assert were invented by Jewish writers, and World War I novels in America, the Jewish novels of 1948 gave meaning to the war. The previous war novels presented the wars, Hemingway, Dos Passos, E. Cummings, as these anarchic forms of mass violence. And they don't find a larger significance to it, and it's a military machine that eats everything in its wake. Jewish authors took a different stance and presented the war in a very different way. Because for Jews, the war of the Nazis was personal, and they were being killed because they were Americans and because they were Jews. And thus it meant that World War II was being fought for a noble reason, and the war was just. So by giving these detailed accounts of the death camps in all of the novels that take place in Europe, these Jewish writers were asserting that what the Nazis were doing was making World War II radically different than World War I. It was a different story. Also, by placing Jewish Americans in these stories within the broader story of the platoon, what they were also aiming to do was explore how minority groups are dealt with by white Americans outside the context of their ethnic enclaves. And that the platoon becomes the perfect place to do that. And what these authors showed in these novels, and all of them, was that for minorities in America, and the platoon was sort of that writ small, a whole sequence of minorities, and they talk about Latinos a lot, and African Americans, they talk about gays, were victimized by fellow soldiers. So what they were doing was they were showing the negative aspects of service because many of them had served. In fact, all of these people had served. And when they came back, what they had experienced, they put into their war novels. And what they were trying to show, that these ugly aspects of what the American military did sort of mirrored the treatment of minorities in America and needed to end. So Jewish war novels also complicate this trend that's very prominent in American historiography of World War II, of challenging World War II as the good war. A lot of sort of historiography has been challenging that recently. The novels both support the idea of the war as just and noble. They don't question that. But what they challenge is the role of the American military and its treatment of minorities. So written in the immediate years after the war, these novels delineate the struggles that these returning Jewish service men and women underwent as they celebrated their successes as effective fighters, while at the same time needing to assert that the final solution and the legacy of anti-Semitism in America meant that they were actually different from white Americans. And they show this very complicated push and pull felt by these Jewish men and women after the war, who desperately wanted to become part of the American mainstream, but they felt the trauma of the Jewish exterminations of Europe and the anti-Semitism that they had gone through in the military far too acutely to just simply sweep it under the rug and move on. And these novels unpack that. So now I want to talk about some of the novels. I'm going to speak first about the two Pacific novels, starting with Norman Mailer's The Naked and the Dead, which I'm sure most of you have read, and it's far and away the most important one. It starts the trend. And then I'll talk about the European ones and what they say about the Holocaust. So for Jewish servicemen in the Pacific, being a Jew did not take on the elevated status that it did in Europe, as I talked about, where it was personal because the Nazis wanted to kill you because you were a Jew. But there is a shadow of the Holocaust that weaves its way into these narratives because these, remember, they were written in 1948 when things were starting to come out. Now, the physical landscape of the Pacific, just to say this very briefly, of course, is very different from in Europe, where when people talk about the European campaigns, what they were talking about was going to sites which resonated with America. They were Europeanized. There was churches, there was towns, there was roads. People often spoke English. When they got to the Pacific, everything was new and alien to them. And they would describe this landscape as, exotic and primitive and childlike, etc. So not only had these soldiers in the Pacific to fight this enemy, which America was telling them, and in some cases was true, that the Japanese often would take very suicidal missions in order to kill them, but they also had to battle a terrain that was new, where there was malaria and insects and dangers within that landscape that was difficult to navigate. So in these stories, that landscape takes on its own narrative. So I want to talk first about The Naked and the Dead, because it's just so important, and it really shaped all of post-war American writing. It was published in 1948, as I said, first one that comes out, and it came out 3 years after the war, and was hailed as the novel of the war. And in writing my book, I've been going to all the archives of my writers, and it was great to go to the Norman Mailer archive, because he went actually to war with this sole intention of writing the great American novel, and he says it from like the first day there. And his mother keeps writing back and saying, "You are writing the great American war novel." So immediately it's hailed as the great American war novel, and I keep thinking his mother must have been so pleased, because she's been saying that for like 3 years in all of the letters to him. So there you go. And it was, immediately, it was the great American war novel. What it did was it challenged the sort of grand ethos of the soldier that Hemingway had written about, but showing that war was this very dirty, nasty business, and it was gritty, and you had to use this very subversively coarse language to talk about it. And that's why he changed fuck to fug, because of he didn't want to get obscenity charges, but he tried to really catch those cadence of how people spoke. But I want to talk about the Jewish elements of the novel, on which almost nothing's been written, even though two of the most central protagonists are Jewish soldiers, and that's Roth and Goldstein. So while Mailer talks about Roth and Goldstein in a way that can be troubling to some, because they have sort of these negative stereotypes, they're weak and they're worried and they're hyper-intellectual and they're not very physically adept, they also come off as being very positive compared to the other warriors in the platoon. Because they have extreme empathy, they're intellectual, they think about what they do, and they're fair and honest, which makes them very different from every other character in the platoon, except the only other ethnic character, who's Martinez, this Mexican soldier, who also comes off that way. So by giving us these two soldiers, what Mailer, I think, was trying to do was give a full array of the complex questions that Jewish soldiers faced in the army. How do you live and work with fellow soldiers when they can be anti-Semitic? How are you friends with members of a platoon who come from these vast, different cultural worlds? How do you deal with anti-Semitism? Because anti-Semitism is in that book from like the second page insistently as the chorus to everything that's happening. Do you ignore it for troop unity, or do you fight back? What's the relationship between Jews and other minorities? In this story, he makes it as Mexican Americans. And how, most importantly, do you define positive masculinity if your culture says positive manhood is intellectualism, and this culture, which is the army, this Anglo-American culture, is instead stressing physicality for men? So he uses Roth and Goldstein to talk about this, and they both find these radically opposite ways of dealing with the question of how can the Jew fit into combat culture. And Roth ends up making a catastrophic choice. They take a reconnaissance patrol, which the whole story is about this reconnaissance patrol in the Pacific. And during the patrol, Roth is constantly belittled by the Irish Catholic anti-Semite Gallagher for being a weak Jew. And so Roth, who's this very sensitive man, finally can't take it anymore. Gallagher belittles him when they're facing this crevice. And Gallagher says, what, are you too weak a Jew to jump that crevice? Even though nobody could jump the crevice, it's clearly suicidal. Roth can't take it, he jumps the crevice and he dies. And that's the end of Roth at that point. And he becomes, it's very much Jesus-like, because at the moment at which he sacrifices himself for the platoon, they all sort of come to themselves and they become better through his act. He wakes them up somewhat. Goldstein takes a completely different tact, which is the one that Mailer himself followed. Goldstein instead befriends a poor Arkansas farmer named Ridges, and this is what Mailer did, whose best friend became also a poor Arkansas farmer. And what I think Mailer was trying to do was showing that another alternative for Jews, and he was obviously extending this into post-war life, was to build up these friendships with non-Jews, because that would be an effective means of fighting hatred. And in the novel, that's how it works. So this novel had this huge impact on Jewish American writing, and war writing in particular. And it set the stage for the literature that followed that I'm going to talk about now, by focusing on the dark underside of service, using gritty language to talk about it, treating the armed services as a symbol for American general, talking about anti-Semitism and racism, and challenging concepts of the enemy. And I'll talk about that now, because the second war novel that was set in the Pacific that was a bestseller was this book called An Act of Love, that I'll talk just very briefly about, because I think it matters because of the way in which it presents the Japanese enemy, and it was the same way Mailer was doing it. So, as you probably know, in the United States during the war, the propaganda machines were directed primarily against the Japanese as being these sort of subhuman, subpar demons, versus European Germans were often considered, the Germans were European, the Japanese were subhuman. They were put in very different categories within American propaganda. In Ira Wolfert's An Act of Love, he does this radical thing when he has the Jewish soldier protagonist in the Pacific Campaign, same stories in Mailer, end up finding a dead American major and burying him with a dead Japanese man, and he puts a sign above them that says brothers. Like, that's a radical thing for somebody to do, and this was a big bestseller. And so what he is doing, and what Mailer was doing as well in his treatment of the Japanese, was they were absolutely rehumanizing the Japanese enemy, to the point at which, in Wolfert's novel, he actually has a quote that says that the Jewish protagonist recognizes in the Japanese enemy someone who, like him, would not be allowed into the country club in America. So what they were trying to do, I think, was reconfigure this idea of the Japanese as subhuman, the German as European, as the Japanese as a fellow minority member. And then when we get to the German books, it will be the Germans who become the subhumans. And this is actually quite radical, and they were doing it in 1948, and they were selling these books. So now I want to do the last part of my talk about the European set novels. And I'm not going to go into detail into any of them, but I'll talk sort of about some of the trends. So the four best-selling 1948 war novels set in the European theater were probably only one you've heard of, which is Irwin Shaw's The Young Lions. I assume most of you have read. And the other four are much minor: That Winter, The Crusaders, and Martha Gellhorn, who was a famous journalist, wrote The Wine of Astonishment. And they cover events in these novels such as D-Day, the liberation of Paris, the Battle of the Bulge, but they offer a very specifically Jewish American take on these events. And as I said, this is evident when all of the novels culminate at the liberation of Dachau. So until that moment in these books, these Jewish American soldiers have to live in these platoons that are absolutely riddled with anti-Semitism to profound and horrifying degrees in these books. It's completely out there. But once they come into contact in these novels with the dead and dying Jews of Europe, the soldier starts to redefine his Jewishness. It's a pinnacle moment. So the novels about the European campaign, when they talk about life in the death camps, they read almost like journalism, because I think what the authors were trying to do was take on the voice of reportage and verisimilitude to try and show their readers that in fact this had happened, and to potentially convince a skeptic public that yes, the machinery of the death camps actually work this way. So the tone switches. And what they were doing here, I think, was trying to get the news of what had happened out to as wide a readership as possible. And Martha Gellhorn, in particular, was there actually. She was the only one who was actually at the liberation of Dachau. She was married to Ernest Hemingway at that point, and Hemingway was incredibly jealous of her. They were both writing dispatches for Collier's weekly magazine. And she somehow always got to the front of everything, and he sort of held back a bit. She didn't have a journalist pass, so she got into Dachau and reported on it. And she said it just changed, it completely changed her whole life at that moment. She became a staunch Zionist after the war. I mean, it radically reorientated herself. But because she was a reporter, it meant that, in particular in her novel, it would have the most extensive sort of journalistic descriptions of the death camps. And in that novel as well, we see this change in the Jewish American happen most emblematically with her main character, Jacob Levy, who starts the war, this assimilated American Jew who's so ashamed to be American, he changes his name to hook up with this Christian girl after the Battle of the Bulge. And when he gets to Dachau, he gets in his car, drives out of the death camp, and mows down and kills 3 German civilians. They arrest him, and he says, I would have killed more if I could have, basically. So it becomes, her rage is transferred on this. In all of these books, Dachau becomes this type scene, as I would term it, that delineates the moment when the Jewish soldier has to reckon with what is his unique status. So the starting point of the Shoah in these books is the moment at which the U.S. Army infantry divisions liberated the camps. The end point is when the Jewish soldier finds a means to acclimate this new view of himself into himself as a Jew and as an American. Moreover, in this very early stage when the exterminations weren't completely broadly out there yet, I don't know if you know that, but there was no word for the Holocaust. It had all these different terms to call it right after the war. But it became, in these books, the thing that the Allied victory mattered most about. And I'll just do a quote that Jacob says in The Wine of Astonishment. He thought that the war was a good thing, and he would write and tell Papa so. They did not make the war because of Dachau, because Dachau fills in for Holocaust, Shoah, etc., because it's still early. If they had, he would certainly have heard about Dachau long ago. But in the end, they reached it, and the SS guards were there, piled up dead in a mound, and their dogs were dead. So the war was a good thing. So these novels became this insistent reminder to the mainstream reading public that the extermination of the Jews had to be remembered, rather than it being just part of these novels about war campaigns and military battles. There was something else central there. Now, if you compare these Jewish war novels that I've been talking about with where the Jewishness is primarily linked to anti-Semitism. In fact, in these war novels, there's nothing positive about being a Jew, actually. It's all about every way it's described as you're a victim of anti-Semitism. To letters sent home by Jewish soldiers, and also a Yiddish writing contest that YIVO had held in 1946, where soldiers were asked to write about, quote, my experiences and observations as a Jew in World War II. There's a massive difference between how the novels were describing what it meant to be a Jewish soldier and, in fact, how those who actually experienced the war described it. In the letters and essays home from Jewish soldiers, Jewishness during the war actually connoted a very positive range of aspects: sharing meals during Jewish holiday services, attending religious services, meeting with rabbis, eating the same foods, talking Yiddish. So what we have in actuality that the war experience heightened and increased the level of soldiers' Jewishness. But by 1948, when all of these authors, all 6 of them, are talking about what it meant to be a Jew in the war, the character is nothing but an exemplifier of anti-Semitism. He has no other aspects about him that are Jewish. And the Jewishness of the characters then become reduced to absolutely nothing more than victimhood. And Jewish critics at the time picked up on this, because I've been reading all the critical reception of it. In 1949, Harold Ribelow wrote an essay called The Jewish GI in American Fiction, and he wrote that the Jewish soldiers are united by the fact that, quote, they never apparently saw the inside of a synagogue. They don't want to. They eat oysters and ham. They have no Jewish education to speak of. They seldom discuss Jewishness or Judaism in any reference other than anti-Semitism, or how being a Jew instills in them a feeling of alienation. And he was not alone in his condemnation. Jewish critics, particularly in commentary, decried this. Alfred Kazin and Leslie Fielder both wrote very caustic pieces about the deracination of Jewishness in the Young Lions, and another review talked about it in An Act of Love, where he said that the main character, quote, is a Jew not so much in his experience or aspirations as in the only life he has is his victimhood. That's what constitutes his Jewishness. Okay, so now I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about one more critic, and then I'm going to end my speech. So where these Jewish critics in the late 40s were bemoaning the absence of any positive portraits of Judaism, and that these soldiers were far more American than Jewish, Anglo critics were taking the opposite tact, and in fact were saying that these Jewish soldiers were far too Jewish. John Aldrich, who was a famous critic, published this book in 1951 about war novels, and he wrote, quote, "Yet the Jewish character in 3 of the new novels of the war and the aftermath," and these are 3 of my 6 novels, The Naked and the Dead, The Young Lions, and That Winter, is distinguished by his Jewishness only. And in the last 2 novels, that one quality so distorts the author's perspective that it forces the character to act in a way that is inconsistent with reality and human nature. So for Aldrich, the troubles of Jews and other minorities, and he keeps sort of switching between Jews, Negroes, and homosexuals, are minor issues, and as he said, they're not central to this age. And this, I think, sheds some important light on these real tensions that were going on in the late 40s and early 50s about how does one view Jews in America. For Jewish critics at the time, an authentic portrait had to include aspects of the culture, while for Aldrich, what they were trying to seek was these universal thematics that negated any specificity, which they felt was sort of too parochial. But while reducing the Jewishness, the authors also, I just want to say this, it's quite crucial, expanded and shifted what masculinity meant in these works. And what they were writing was that to be masculine in America, particularly Jewish and masculine, meant to take on aspects of the soldier. And this is sort of this parallel trend with the Sauber construction. Heroic, strong, loyal, tough, physically adept. So the heroism and positive masculinity that these books wrote about the Jewish soldier was also, though, a challenge to the anti-Semitic charges that Jewish men were weak and cowardly. They used these reconstructed visions of Jewish masculinity to show Americans that through military service, Jewish men had transformed into ideal, strong Americans. Okay, so now I'm going to conclude with just a few themes and then take some questions. So having just risked their lives to fight for this idea of America, the Jewish authors who wrote these novels, and all of them served, wrote these portraits, good, bad, beautiful, ugly, of what it meant to be an American man. And they were not only showing the troubled divisions in the United States, as the platoon was symbolizing with the anti-Semitism, but also this possibility for a new type of brotherhood. And that comes up in all the books about the new brotherhood between Christians and Jews. But they also show that in the post-war era, Jewish men had few options. And we tend to, the post-war Jewish America is called the Golden Age. I think it was much more complicated than that if you look at some of the gender questions that were going on. Either they could hold on to their ethnic backgrounds, and in these books, the backgrounds of the parents are crippled and weak, those parents from Europe, or they become reinvented as new Americans. So like pioneers heading west, the Jewish soldiers returned home and felt that they were in this new land, and to survive they had to keep hold of what they had before, which is tough, braveness, etc. And all these, in every single novel, the ultimate prize becomes the Christian wife. There's no Jewish woman in these novels. They all end with the Christian wife. That proves that you have become a real American hero. They also show that it exacerbates these problems. As I said, either you could do an extreme response, the suicide, or you could have to work twice as hard to prove yourself, or you can make new friendships. But you had to find a means to survive as a Jew. The popularity of these novels is something I've been asking myself. Why were these such huge bestsellers? I mean, why did they dominate absolutely in the 40s and 50s? And I think that, in part, even though this might sound questionable or ugly for me to say this, but I think they posited the Jewish American soldier as a counter image to the Jewish European victim of the Nazis. So for some, it may have been inspiring and refreshing to read about Jewish soldiers who kill Germans rather than who are exterminated by them. And Gellhorn wrote about this in her book. Quote, she said, it was like spitting in the Kraut's face for the Jew to survive. So intentionally or not, the Jewish American soldier was standing in stark contrast with the negative stereotype of the passive Jewish victim of the Holocaust. America had transformed him from a weak sufferer into this proactive warrior who fought and slayed the enemies. And I think that the popularity of these books suggests that they were offering mainstream readers an appealing vision of an American Jew after the war. The last thing I just want to point out, which I haven't really talked about, which is incredibly striking when you read these books, is that although this Jewish war becomes capable and strong, in 4 of the novels he dies, often outside the theater of war, in order to teach non-Jews to become better men. And in all of these instances, there's a very sort of Christian element to it, where the Jew becomes this Christ-like figure, and his death purifies the landscape and humanity returns. So this trend of having the Jewish protagonist prove his heroism and then die was another way in which I think all of these novels, even though set in the Pacific, were responding to the Holocaust. It may have been an attempt on the part of the authors to transform these absolutely dehumanized portraits of piles of corpses into these single, very human and very beloved protagonists in these novels whose death completely alters the world around them. So from this sort of countless slaughter evocative of basically nothing, which was how sort of the Holocaust was starting to come out, the Jewish American soldier's death brings on a range of important results in these stories. So to end now, the novels of these 6 writers, best-selling writers, delineate, I think, how Jewish men and women, but particularly men, felt this newfound confidence, in other words, that they could talk about the anti-Semitism, but also this fear in which his Jewish protagonist either has to have no Jewish elements or die and sacrifice himself for the group. They were all composed after the war, right? They all were composed afterwards and were for post-war readership, so their intention was twofold. First, I think what they were trying to do was show that the Jews underwent something very specific during the war because they had to deal with so much anti-Semitism that what it meant was that Jewish soldiers had undergone a much different and harder range of experiences than general American GIs. And it also meant highlighting that during the war, the Holocaust had occurred and it was intrinsic to understanding those events. The novels, though, also were engaging in cultural work for a post-war readership, and they were talking forward. It meant showing that anti-Semitism was German and there was no room for it in America. It meant delineating that the Jews had been heroic soldiers and that they were equal to America's bravest, so Jews had to now be accepted into mainstream life. And finally, it meant asserting that a basic American value was pluralism and that all communities, including blacks, Jews, and Mexicans, needed to be valued in post-war life. So what they were doing, and particularly I think they did because they were such huge bestsellers over and over again, it's up to 1961, was Jewish war novels were therefore shaping the understanding of post-war Americans about the events that had just happened in the war, and also about how they should treat Jews and other minorities in the decades that would follow as they looked forward. So that's my talk, and thank you, and I'd like to hear questions or comments.